What if I told you there's an ancient reading of Acts chapter 2 that really illuminates that passage? That what happened at Pentecost wasn't just a random miracle, but it ties into, it has echoes of three massive Old Testament events. What if I told you that Luke, the author of Acts, may have left some subtle clues that you can pick up if you're reading the Greek Old Testament, that is the Septuagint? Today I want to walk you through three Old Testament events. And the first two you might have heard of, but I think once you get to the third one, it'll really possibly even blow your mind. It's subtle, it's easy to miss, but I want you to see it because I think it'll help you read Acts chapter 2 in a way that you've never read it before, and you'll probably won't read the passage the same way after this. Now, if you're one of those people who love to get deep into the weeds and go down into topics like this, and you make it all the way to the end of this video, type in, as is our custom around here nowadays, type in the comments, digging deep. So let's go ahead and dive into this. So I trust you know the background of the story. This is when Jesus has been appearing to his disciples, and he has promised them that there would be an arrival of the Spirit of God. And in Acts chapter 2, there the disciples are. They're one place, one accord, and the promise of the Spirit arrives. A rushing mighty wind fills the place, and cloven tongues, the King James Version says, a fire sat upon each of them, and they began to speak in tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Now, in the third point, we're going to talk about why speaking in tongues. That seems like an odd miracle if you don't understand the allusions that are happening here, but we'll get to that in the third point. But first, I want to kind of set this up. Luke drops in a little clue for us as to one of the major Old Testament events that I think we have echoes of in Acts chapter 2. And in Acts chapter 1 and verse 15, it says this, "And in those days Peter stood up in the midst of the disciples. Altogether the number of names was about 120. Okay, so 120 is not a very common number in Scripture. It's just interesting that maybe he could have rounded this to 100, but 120, he gives us that number. Again, not super common in the Bible, but it does show up in a very key place, and that is 2 Chronicles chapter 5. 2 Chronicles chapter 5 is important because this talks to us about the dedication of the temple that Solomon has built. Solomon's built a temple, and a key moment happens in 2 Chronicles chapter 5. This portion is just a little bit longer, but bear with me. The details here are important. So in 2 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 12, "And the Levites who were the singers, all those of Asaph and Heman and Jeduthun, with their sons and their brethren, stood at the east end of the altar, clothed in white linen, having cymbals, stringed instruments, and harps, and with them 120 priests, sounding with trumpets. Indeed, it came to pass when the trumpeters and singers were as one, to make one sound to be heard in praising and thanking the Lord. And when they lifted up their voice with the trumpets and cymbals and instruments of music, and praised the Lord, saying, For he is good, for his mercy endures forever, that the house of the Lord was filled with a cloud, so that the priests could not continue ministering because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord filled the house of God." What a beautiful passage. Solomon has built this physical structure, and God himself has allowed his presence to come into that structure. And there were present of the Levites 120. Isn't it striking to us that when the day of Pentecost was fully come, and they were all in one place and in one accord, it says, just as 2 Chronicles told us that the trumpeters and singers were as one, to make one sound. When these men were gathered in one accord, God is not filling a physical structure now. He is filling a spiritual, he's making a spiritual house. He's reconstituting what the temple really is. There are a number of parallels between the dedication of the temple that Solomon built and what happens in Acts chapter 2. We could run through a bunch of these, but just to recap very quickly, 120 priests in 2 Chronicles chapter 5, 120 disciples in Acts chapter 1. Priests blow trumpets in unison in 2 Chronicles 5. The disciples are in unison in Acts chapter 2. The house is filled with a cloud in 2 Chronicles chapter 5. The house is filled with a rushing mighty wind in Acts chapter 2. In Second Chronicles chapter 7 and verse 1, it says that when Solomon had made an end of praying, the fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices. Here we have in Acts chapter 2 fire that sits upon the disciples who are to become living sacrifices. The laver in Second Chronicles chapter 4 sits upon 12 oxen, it tells us. And in Acts chapter 2, we find the 12 apostles as a new foundation for the work of God. That those 12 oxen that hold up the laver, it actually holds, we're given the detail in Second Chronicles chapter 4 and verse 5, that it holds 3,000 baths. Isn't it interesting that in Acts chapter 2, there are 3,000 souls that are added to the church and baptized? The glory of the Lord had filled a physical temple in Second Chronicles chapter 5, but in Acts chapter 2, and this is a theme that runs throughout the book of Acts, you can see it's the very reason why Stephen gets stoned. The people were accusing him of speaking against the temple, and Stephen boldly proclaims that God is no longer going to dwell in a house made by hand, a house made of stones, but it's going to be a living temple. God is taking up his reside in the hearts of people. Now, these are powerful parallels, I think. But the truth is, Luke is not done, because what happens in Acts chapter 2 doesn't just echo the dedication of Solomon's temple, it also perfectly fulfills the meaning of the feast day on which it happened, that is Pentecost. So let's head right into the next one. Okay, now why did it have to happen on the day of Pentecost? Let me make 4 points here. First, let's define what Pentecost actually means. Pentecost is from a Greek word that means 50th. And for whatever it's worth, this isn't the main allusions that we're going to talk about later to the Septuagint, but this does come from the Septuagint. This Feast of Pentecost comes 50 days after Passover. The second point I want to make is that it always happened on a Sunday. Pentecost was always celebrated after the Sabbath day. And so it's very striking that Jesus rises on the first day. He chooses to inaugurate the church on the first day. And that is why I think both of those twin reasons that Christians began to celebrate and come together on the Lord's day. John says in Revelation chapter 1, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. Third point, there was a presentation of 2 loaves during this time. Many Jews, as I said at the beginning of this, saw this as the time that God gave the law at Sinai, and they would have seen it in some ways as the birth of Israel in terms of becoming a covenant nation. And so this is significant that God is reconstituting both Jew and Gentile during this time. Now, the ramifications of Acts chapter 2, I realize it's just Jews to begin with in Acts chapter 2, but the ramifications of what happens from Acts chapter 2 is that this word is going beyond just the boundaries of ethnic Israel to include Gentiles as well. The fourth point I'll bring out is that those 2 loaves were presented with leaven. So unlike Passover, Pentecost included leavened bread, which is interesting because leaven is a picture of sin in the Old Testament, which I think it perfectly conveys the idea that we are living in the church age and that we too are wrestling and fighting against sin. We're not sinless people. And let me just bring out just one other thing here. Pentecost was a great time for this to happen as well, because one source I read that because this is a feast day, it was one of the times that the nation of Israel would gather together, the population would swell. One estimate put the number at over 1 million people, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million people in Jerusalem at the time of Pentecost. This not only fulfilled the time of the feast, but as we're about to see, it perfectly illustrates one of the great reversals that happens from the Old Testament. And let's just go right into that right now. So Acts chapter 2 serves as the answer to the Tower of Babel. In Genesis chapter 11, God has crushed the pride of humanity who sought to unite against him, build a tower that reaches to heaven, build a name for themselves. God scatters the people. He divides their languages. But the opposite is what's happening in Acts chapter 2. God is regathering his people. it's interesting to note that in Genesis chapter 11, it says, "Let us go down and there confound their language." When it uses the word confound there, the Greek word is synkeo, and that Greek word signifies, to confuse. But what's significant about this is Luke is a person who often draws upon the Greek Septuagint. His writing betray the style of someone whose first language was Greek. His Greek is often commented as a higher register than some of the Greek and other parts of the Greek New Testament. He was familiar, in other words, with this story from the Old Testament. And I should mention here that a number of very early writers, I'm talking 4th, 5th century, picked up on these allusions to Genesis chapter 11 in Acts chapter 2. This isn't a new idea, although it's a forgotten idea, that what's happening in Acts chapter 2 is this great reversal. And that same word, synkeo, is used in Acts 2:6. And with this sound occurred, the multitude came together and were confused. They were confounded. But now Peter's going to rise up and give a speech to show them that God is doing a new thing. He's going to pour out his Spirit upon all flesh. It's great news. It's good news. And so that God is reconstituting a people. Now, one of the interesting things as you're reading along there is that there's a long list of names, of nations, of various nations, of people that were there to hear these people speak in tongues. And Luke gives us all of these names, and you wonder why go through all that list. And now I'm going to quote from Craig Keener in his IVP Bible Background Commentary. He says this: "Some commentators have thought that this list of nations corresponds to ancient astrological lists, but the parallels are not very close. More likely is the proposal that Luke has simply updated the names of nations in the table of nations, Genesis 10. Those nations were scattered at the Tower of Babel, where God judged them by making them unintelligible to each other, Genesis 11. Here, God reverses the judgment in a miracle that transcends the language barrier." So, that list of nations that God has scattered are there present in Jerusalem, and now they're hearing every man speak in his own tongue. Why? Because God's rescue mission is going out to those nations. The gospel's to go out into all the world. Whereas Israel has been his chosen people, his special people, now this message is going to go beyond Israel's borders and go into those nations, because Jesus has spoiled powers and principalities, and the way has been opened that these nations can now be evangelized. This may indeed be the reason why we mentioned at the beginning of this video that the cloven tongues appeared upon each of them. Cloven or divided tongues. Divided tongues. When God divided the nations, he also divided their tongues. He also divided their languages. They couldn't speak to one another. And it is interesting. Diamorizo is the word that's used in the Greek to describe these cloven tongues. And it is interesting that that is the same Greek word that appears in Deuteronomy 32:8. In the Septuagint, when the Most High distributed the nations, as he scattered the descendants of Adam, he set up boundaries for the nations according to the number of the angels of God. So why the gift of tongues in Acts chapter 2? I think that one of the reasons is that they are a signpost that God is allowing his gospel to go out to all nations, all the nations that have been scattered at Babel and beyond. God is calling his people. He is gathering his people now in the church, and I think that's good news. So if you like this sort of thing and you like digging deep into these sorts of things, you might like this video here that I did in regards to the giving of the law, what the Septuagint has to say about that.